Hey folks, in this video I want to talk a little bit about operating system interfaces. So we're going to take a look at kind of the two main variants. So the first thing is going to be command line interfaces. In a future video we'll talk about graphical user interfaces, or GUIs. So this is a way you may or may not have interacted with a system. And actually, before I go through the slide, let me actually bring up a command line interface. So right now I'm using a Windows machine. So I'm actually going to exit this for a second and bring up the command prompt. So this is my command prompt here. So you can see here, right, that I'm basically staring at a text-based interface, right? So normally I'm used to making, I'm on Windows, right? I have a desktop I look at, I double-click programs, I want to do stuff. This is actually another way to interact with Windows. And there's going to be, for different options, there's going to be different ways basically to get to this, right? And this is what we call a console window. So this is a text-based way to interact with my system. So here I'm looking at it, and you can see it says up here, Microsoft Windows version 10, right? Copyright 2018. And then I have this blinking thing here, right? And my blinking cursor, right? And then I have this path here, users presenter. So let me just type something here. I'm typing dir. It shows me the contents of this folder, right? So this is actually a way basically to interact with the file system on your computer, right? So normally I could just go to my desktop. Actually, let me do this real quick. So I'm going to navigate to my desktop in this command line window, right? So notice it shows desktop, right? And I have all these things here, right? Notice I have an EGR 598 folder, I have IFT 530, Microsoft Edge, I have all these different things on desktop here, right? I'm looking at this kind of text view of it. I can, of course, right, also jump over to the actual desktop, right? So this is the desktop on the computer that I'm recording on, right? All the stuff going on, cool background picture, et cetera, et cetera. But I have a different way to interact with it, right? I can also interact with it in this way, right? I have a text-based view, okay? So this is what we call basically a command line interface. And there's different commands basically that I can use to do things. So I've been using this command dir, which is directory, right? It displays the contents of my directory. I also have other commands. So for example, I can type cd, which is change directory, and I can go into kind of other folders. I can go into EGR 598, right? I notice my bottom here has changed because I've moved up a level. I can go back, right? I can do cd ... I can move backwards as well, right? And so there's all these different commands. Right, and I can kind of move back. You can see that's a list there of all the different users on this computer. Now I'm at what they call the root drive, right, at the very base. So yeah, I can do all sorts of things. And I can also do things like, for example, create folders, create files, et cetera, et cetera. I won't show you how to use this right now, but just be aware, right? This is kind of what we're talking about. This is a way to use your system. All right. So that was a command line interface, right? Hopefully you guys have used them. Maybe not. It would be nice if you have. You're going to actually have to use them in this course because we're going to do some things that basically you can't do in a graphical interface, right? There's not going to be these options that we need exposed. You're going to need to open up that command line interface and type in specific commands to do things. All right. So for me, okay. Well, so depending on who you're talking to, this kind of mechanism is maybe the easiest way to interact with a computer. Notice that when you use a command line interface, you're kind of very focused. You're doing one command at a time. You don't have to worry about different things being open at the same time. You just are doing on one thing at a time, right? And you don't have to have this well, I guess the mouse isn't complicated, but somehow, right, there's this sense that when you're working with a text-based interface, right, you're issuing specific commands, right? You're not having to decide, oh, do I click here or there? How fast do I click? How many times do I click? You're not having to do that. You kind of are just doing text, which maybe is simple, maybe it's simpler, but it's not as intuitive, I suppose. All right. So we have this idea basically that there is a command interpreter, right? So you saw me typing, for example, dir. That is a command. And I type, for example, cd. Again, those are both commands. So there is basically this little engine, right, inside your operating system that parses those commands. It looks at whatever I type and tries to do things, right? Because I can type other things. For example, let's go back. I can type blah, blah, blah. This is not a program, right? This is not a command. So it basically is looking and saying, oh, I just typed in garbage. It can't do anything with that. Okay, so there's some sort of little engine there, right, that basically is trying to figure out what is it that you mean, right? I could also do things like, for example, this, cd blah, 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 and I get back an error, path is not found, okay? So there's some sort of an engine behind the scenes that basically is parsing my text and trying to figure out what is it that I want to do, okay? So that's our command interpreter. There are kind of different interpreters or different interfaces I could use, right, to interact with my system in a text-based way. Another term they use basically is the term shell, right, which basically means that system which supports reading your input from the user, parsing it, right, returning the result, right. So that kind of user interface. So in a sense, right, I'm using here like the CMD shell, I suppose would be one way to say it. Normally, shell is a term they use for Linux, not for Windows, but it's okay for now. All right. So for a particular operating system, you may have different shells, right? So here I use basically the normal interface, right, which is called CMD on Windows, the command interface. There's other ones, for example, PowerShell, which is another one you can install on Windows. It'll give me kind of the same interface, right, the text-based thing, but it'll add basically more commands for me to use. Okay, so it's a little bit different flavor there, right? Basically, it's like text-based ways to interact with my system. Also, I have an example here, right? So we talked about the Windows one, which is up top right. There's also the Linux one, right? So there's Linux, I'm looking at the Bash interface, right? This is going to be one you're going to get very used to in this course. We're going to have to use it several times. It kind of works the same way, right? I'm entering text-based commands, right? Those get parsed, some action occurs, right? But obviously the commands are different because it's a different operating system. All right, so when you're implementing these things, right? This is kind of my final remark here, right? So when you're implementing these things, there's a couple different things you can do. So we want, right, this program, right, this thing called a shell, which parses our text-based commands and does things based on what I tell it to do. There's two general techniques to implement them. The first is for it to be basically self-contained or monolithic, right? So for some operating systems, basically when we type in a command, so basically, right, one program running, and this program basically looks at what the user enters, and based on what the user enters, it carries out that specific task, right? So it's self-contained. Versus other programs, right, or other operating systems will basically have the approach of they'll have one little program that tries to parse your input, and then based on what your input looks like, it'll run something else, right? So for example, when I type dir, maybe it runs a program called dir that displays the contents of the directory, right? Rather than it just doing it on its own, right? So I can have that shell program either be self-contained, carry out all those actions itself, or it can basically defer, right? So when I type dir, it runs a program. When I type cd, it runs a program, and so on and so forth, right? So that's what we call a modular system, right? Where I just have one little general parser, and that parser makes calls to other programs to carry out specific commands. All right, so that's the basic idea of a command line interface. We'll get a lot more comfortable, right, with the idea of command line interfaces later on as we go through and we do more work in this course, right? We're going to have to do this basically, we're going to use the command line later on, basically do things like run programs in a certain way. So we'll definitely get more comfortable with it. All right, so that's all I got for this video. Next video, we'll talk a little bit about graphical user interfaces.